John Brown weren't known, but I was gonna stick by the captain, same as he always stuck by me, crazy as he may be.
We're gonna start a revolution.
John Brown. The Good Lord Bird is a miniseries on Showtime. The protagonist is this fictional slave character called Onion, Little Henry Onion Shackelford. And this is a young man who, for some reason, is in a dress the entire miniseries. It's sort of centered on Little Onion and his perspective rather than John Brown's perspective. Full disclosure, I have a painting of John Brown on my wall. Some people in the comment section are going to say that I'm biased. They always do. You can't make everybody happy. But I do have to say, I have a particular affinity for John Brown. That's why a few things in this miniseries kind of rub me the wrong way, but I'm going to give the creators the benefit of the doubt because they are the artists and not me. Before we get into the miniseries called The Good Lord Bird, if you don't know who John Brown is, that is a shame, and I blame the public school system yet again. John Brown was an abolitionist who tried to start a slave rebellion in Virginia. It didn't work, and he was hanged. He was hanged by the state of Virginia. John Brown's goal was to start the Civil War, and he eventually did start that Civil War because he became a martyr to the North. You ever hear this little ditty?
John Brown's body lies a-moaning in the grave, but his truth still marches on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth still marches on.
He's kind of a big deal.
My name is Captain John Brown, and I am here in the name of the great Redeemer, the King of Kings.
John Brown happens into Little Onion's life in Kansas. He acts up in a barbershop, and Little Onion's father was the barber. Onion's father is killed, kind of because John Brown can't act right. And he never could act right, and that's historically accurate. That's why John Brown is famous. But after Onion's father is killed, he goes to stay with John Brown, or he is kidnapped by John Brown. John Brown is played by Ethan Hawke, who also does a fantastic job. He created this miniseries from a book called The Good Lord Bird by James McBride. Anyway, John Brown, played by Ethan Hawke, kind of abducts Little Onion. And he confuses Little Onion for a girl, so he forces him to wear a dress the entire miniseries. This was an interesting choice for me, but I will come back to this later. So the story is initially set in Kansas in the 1850s. Now this was known as Bleeding Kansas because the Kansas Territory was about to join the Union, and there was a dispute as to whether that new territory should be slave territory or free territory. Because we had agreed that there would be no more slave territory, but they came in bullying people, pushing them around, and so John Brown had to come in and save the day. John Brown at the time was in the Adirondacks trying to establish a colony of freed blacks because he knew that if they got the land, not only could they support themselves, but they could also vote and they'd be full-fledged citizens, just the way things were back then. Anyway, his sons called for him and said, these pro-slavery advocates are acting up, they're cheating, please come down and help us. And boy, he did. He whooped them on many an occasion. He kind of became an abolitionist hero. He got the nickname Osawatomie Brown. That's where John Brown meets Little Onion. Now, if you're familiar with the history, you know that in Kansas, John Brown did some things that he found to be necessary, but maybe history might argue with him. Particularly, he hacked up a pro-slavery family that didn't own any slaves. This was because of his tit-for-tat kind of mentality. That if they're going to take some of ours, we got to take some of theirs. I don't know if this turned out to be the most moral thing he could do. He certainly was a militant Christian. So this is a very interesting choice for John Brown. A lot of people at the time said that John Brown was completely out of line in hacking up this man and his sons to death. When I say it like that, it seems it was some legitimate ISIS level stuff. They address this in The Good Lord Bird. Little Onion does not want anything to do with John Brown after this, but he's gone too far. He's already upset his massa, so he can't really go back. It's too late for him to go back. Now, Onion briefly separates from John Brown, and he goes off. He finds his way to a whorehouse where he gets work. She gets work. This whole time, Onion is in a dress. That was one of the artistic choices of the author. So whereas we see him as a boy, clearly a boy, they see him as a girl. She gets work in a whorehouse. She encounters a slave, he encounters a slave revolt, actually plays a part in the slave revolt, gets a few people killed. We meet this character called Pie, who Little Onion is absolutely in love with because she's beautiful. She is played by Natasha Mark, and she's by far the most attractive woman in this whole series. Everybody is in love with her. It seems as though the racism of the pro-slavery side kind of ends when they see Pie, because they're just like, well, she's beautiful. Nothing more to that. Anyway, this episode, which John Brown really isn't a part of until the end, takes place just with Little Onion. And I was thinking, I kind of signed on for John Brown, not really Little Onion, but this is a fiction and I'll give it to them. It also kind of shows us that there was no uniform thought amongst the slaves themselves, because Pie was in a privileged position and she didn't want that ruined by these other slaves, these unprivileged slaves, these poor slaves that lived out back trying to revolt or anything.
They're planning to hang 9 slaves for a plot of insurrection.
Pain ain't nothing new to me.
So she snitched on them. She sold them out and they were hanged. In another episode, we visit the North. We go to Rochester, New York, and there we visit with Frederick Douglass and a lot of other abolitionists. Little Onion sort of remarks about how civilized everything is. It was a functioning industrial society by this point. Kansas certainly wasn't. I found it really interesting how the filmmakers pointed out that at that time, the North was in a privileged position. We weren't anywhere near the battlefields. We weren't gonna go anywhere near the battlefields except for a few who were conscripted to go. It was a war down there because they were messing up. Little Onion points out they didn't really consort with black people either. They were more segregated than they were down south, but they still had this holier-than-thou ideology. That was really interesting. That gave me something to think about. They didn't have many black people at their abolitionist meetings except for Frederick Douglass, who is portrayed as a celebrity. He's played by Daveed Diggs, and he's sort of portrayed as the king of the blacks, this celebrity who doesn't have to follow any of the other rules of society because he's above it all. He's kind of portrayed as this early influencer. He really likes the idea of pictures, even though you had to sit for a few minutes to get your picture done back then. He really likes that idea. And I also thought that it was played really, really well because he was not perfect. He did have a white mistress, and he didn't necessarily play by the rules that were expected of others. He was sort of a proto-celebrity. Now, the last few episodes of the series are about the failed raid at Harper's Ferry.
My name's Harriet Tubman. John Brown don't have to explain nothing to me. If he says he has a good plan, he has a good plan.
John Brown's body lies moaning in the grave.
If you're ever in the West Virginia area, I highly recommend that you swing by and see all the sites that have to do with that raid. They sided with the North. That's why there is a West Virginia. They had to break off from regular Virginia, but that's beside the point. So even though he was technically hanged by Virginia, all the sites are in West Virginia. The important part of the history, and they make this clear in the show, is not that the raid happened. It's that John Brown wasn't killed, and that when he was caught, he was allowed to write letters from prison. We sort of touched on this in the Amusing Ourselves to Death video. We talked about how literate a culture the North was back in the day. And John Brown writing all these letters sort of sold his case to the North. Because before this letter writing campaign, they were just like, John Brown, old man Brown, just making a mess. Just acting up and doing what he does, probably killing a lot of innocent people, which he did. The first person who died was actually a black man, a free black man. So that's really sad and doesn't go along with the history the way we all want it to. But the letter writing campaign itself is what sold the story. That was the marketing aspect. And that's why John Brown became a martyr. I just thought they did a great job of showing that. I don't know why they chose to leave out Osborne Anderson, because he was the free black person that survived Harper's Ferry and ended up writing about it. They sort of distributed his character between Little Onion and Bob, and I didn't really like that. I think Osborne Anderson should have been his own character in this. He was very important to the raid and to the history as it was written after the raid. Also, historically speaking, there is no indication that the railwayman, who in this case is played by Orlando Jones, does a fantastic job, had anything to do with the raid. or anything to do with the conspirators at all. The man's name is Hayward Shepherd, and he was killed in the raid, and it was actually a tragedy. And since that's happened, the South has been trying to use his death to tarnish Brown, and maybe they should. He was an innocent being killed. He also wasn't a conspirator. They made him a conspirator in this, but he wasn't. He was just a man with a family who died tragically. It's been a black mark. That having been said, Orlando Jones plays him wonderfully. His death in this is an exceptional tragedy. It shows that Brown's men were kind of bumbling. The Good Lord Bird is actually a comedy, and I feel that it has to be a comedy in order to introduce some of the ideas that it introduces. Little Onion spends a lot of time making fun of these foolish northern white abolitionists, these white liberals. And people like to make fun of white liberals to this day, for good reason. The abolitionists did not represent most of the North. They did represent the best of the North, though. And that small group of abolitionists was trying to get rid of slavery because it was an evil. And plus, we were founded on freedoms. Also, another point that I found, let's say, interesting, is that the main character was a mulatto teenager in a dress. And in The Good Lord Bird, most whites, nearly every white, thinks that Little Onion is a girl just because he's in a dress. John Brown had been around black people his entire life. In reality, I don't think John Brown would confuse a young man for a young woman, even if he is in a dress. Now, at first I thought, well, are they trying to shoehorn modern politics and modern society into a mini-series about the Civil War, pre-Civil War actually? That's really not appropriate. But I will give the author the benefit of the doubt. James McBride, the author, says that he did this to show that the white people didn't really see blacks at all. They didn't see them as individuals. That blacks were just set pieces in the drama that was going on among the whites. If you've been online at all in the past 10 years, you know that black people are suspicious of Hollywood trying to emasculate black men by putting them in a dress.
When I connect dots that maybe shouldn't be connected, I don't know. But certain dots, like when I see that they put every black man in the movies in a dress at some point in their career, I'll be connecting them down like, why all these brothers gotta wear a dress?
I think a lot of black men have done it out of wanting to get to the next level. That's my opinion. I can't do that shit. I'm not doing it. Black masculinity has always been a threat to the white majority. It always has been.
So that kind of piqued my interest here. I'm thinking, wait, why is he in a dress? I know it's a comedy, but that's not that funny. The dress itself, I felt, was not used especially for comedic effect. He was in a dress the entire series up until the very last episode. It's a young man in a dress. And that is the protagonist of a story about John Brown. Of a story about John Brown, the men who followed him, including free black men and former slaves that chose to fight for their own freedom. This is the most action movie badass story there is in American history, and they chose to go about it by putting the main character, who's completely fictional, by the way, there was no Little Onion, creating that character and putting him in a dress. I just thought that was interesting as all. I didn't think it was funny, haha. I thought it was like funny, like, huh, the main character is in a dress. The creators, the filmmakers, the author thought it would be funny to do that, and I respect their choice. The part that made me go, the most was Little Onion implying that slavery was a good time. And I've seen this argument online in defense of slavery. If someone had said that, I would assume, oh, you're a racist. It's sort of sacrilege. It's sort of blasphemy. Like, what are you saying? You saying slavery was a good time? You saying that you enjoyed having a massa? But like I said, I'm reading this book called The Renegade History of the United States, and he sort of goes into that argument as well, kind of explains it very clearly. I'm not saying I support it, but I understand what may have been in James McBride's mind when he was writing this book. That is probably the most out there idea of this whole show. But a piece of art that makes you think is kind of good art, isn't it? The Northern way of life was so bad that there was another rebellion against it after this. The labor movement was pushing back against the Northern way of life. That's how bad it was. And so for the North to come and try to impose their views on the whole country, I kind of understand. I understand why James McBride wanted to make this point. And I understand why that point was made in the Renegade History of the United States. Do I necessarily agree with it? I can't say that I do. But from an 1850s perspective, I can understand why Little Onion would have something to say about it. Now, I'm living on the other side of the labor movement. So I'm thinking, of course the Northern way of life was better. Of course that's why he was trying to impose it on the whole country. But from the other side of the labor movement, you might be thinking, these people were working 16-hour days. These children were dying in the mills. This is not something you should be imposing on the whole country right now. So I get it. And that part really made me think. It was really brave of Ethan Hawke and James McBride to broach the subject of the good and bad of slavery at all. Because we never hear about the good of slavery. Obviously, it's slavery. There is something to be said for Little Onion's perspective. John Brown asks him to give a speech in front of abolitionists and to say how evil the institution of slavery is. But Little Onion couldn't do it. Little Onion says, no, John Brown, I'd never seen any violence. No one had ever hit me, and I'd never been hungry until I met you. And John Brown's kind of thrown back.
Truth be told, I ain't seen a person murdered till I met you.
I would stay off that subject entirely.
The way of life that John Brown himself was pushing on everybody else wasn't that great. In fact, after John Brown died, his family left the Adirondacks and went to California because it's really hard to farm the Adirondacks. It's cold up there, the farming season is short, and people are miserable. So his wife and surviving children went to California and they led their best life. They couldn't have done that if John Brown were still alive, because John Brown was a religious zealot. I think they make him seem like a fool. I don't think he was a fool. Even by the standards of the time, he could see past his immediate comfort. He lost sons in the interest of defeating slavery. He upended his entire life in the interest of defeating slavery. And that's actually really interesting because his sons were basically slaves to him. That's the way things were at the time. Children were slaves to their father. People don't want to acknowledge it, but that's why Lincoln was mostly against slavery, because his father treated him like a slave. They really get into that in The Good Lord Bird. Little Onion says explicitly that the people in the South treat their slaves only slightly worse than they treat other white people. This is revolutionary thinking where I'm from. So overall, yes, I would recommend The Good Lord Bird to watch, but just watch it with these things in mind. That maybe it's not 100% historically accurate. It's entertaining, it's well shot, it's well acted, the story is absolutely there, and the artists made some artistic choices. Yes, I have to take a few points off for blasphemy, but this is not a point system. So overall, I would definitely recommend that you watch it and let me know what you think. It's definitely thought-provoking. I will give it that. And that is kind of the best thing you can say about a piece of art. Spoiler alert, at the very end, before John Brown is hanged, he looks out over the crowd of onlookers who came to watch him die, and he says, "What a beautiful country." And I was wondering, does the character of John Brown finally see America for how flawed she really is, and finally see the people for how flawed they really are, and learn to accept and love them anyway? Or is he still stuck in his delusion that there is absolute good and absolute evil, and that he is a representative of absolute good? I don't really know. I don't really know what was meant by this last line. But it is really interesting to think that he finally was able to accept America as flawed, as fundamentally flawed, and love her anyway. Just a thought.